Hello and welcome to another episode of Spart Talk. Today I'm joined by Comrades Vincent and Eibhlin, who lead the work of our British section, to discuss what every leftist in Britain is talking about, the announcement by Zarah Sultana that she's going to form a new left party with Corbyn. Now, this is obviously a big deal for many reasons, and we do think that such a development would be a good one because Labour is thoroughly right-wing right now, and the right wing in general, reform, is growing, and the left is scattered into a million grouplets. But before we, and the left more generally, get ahead of ourselves, we think it's necessary to discuss the lessons of Corbynism. However, before we even do that, let's just take a look at recent developments since Zarah Sultana made this announcement and what's happened since. So, comrades, if one of you just wants to start us off by talking about what's just happened and what's been the reaction in the British left milieu to this announcement.
Well, it's been, since the announcement was made, it's been a little bit like there's an expression in Ireland. When there's a new party being formed, the first question on the agenda is the split. It got off to a false start with people briefing that Corbyn did not want the announcement to be made by Zarah Sultana, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a bit of a disaster in that sense. But on the other hand, it is broadly welcomed that there is going to be some kind of left-wing opposition to Starmer. It's long overdue, and many, many thousands of people obviously hate Starmer and the Labour government. So it's a positive development, but off to a very shaky start as regards its organizational structure.
Texts were leaked to the media. There's been there's all sorts of rumors. It seemed Corbyn, was really unhappy with Zarah Sultana because some people don't want Zarah Sultana to lead it. Some people want only Corbyn to lead it. And then everybody's full of grievances and leaking stuff to the press. Yeah, so a big mess.
I mean, I do know that most groups on the left have put out some kind of a statement in relation to this development, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, as you mentioned, Eibhlin, long overdue, overall good thing. We just hope that it's actually able to get off the ground. And I think linked to that, unless you guys have something else to say, why don't we actually just talk about what the conception of this party is as per Zarah Sultana's announcement. She's doing it with Corbyn. Corbyn, everybody's been looking to him for years to take a stand, to form his new party, to do 100 million other things. But let's just discuss the Corbyn phenomenon and actually the lessons of Corbyn to make sense of what this party should and should not do.
Yeah. If I can just say over the before getting into the lesson of Corbynism, like what type of party is that going to be? Obviously, we don't know. And it's a big if at this point, if there's going to be anything. Probably there will be, but given the start, it's a big if. And even in terms of a party, I think, well, no one really knows because it's been all secret. There's not a program. I think apparently Corbyn wants a loose coalition of independents. Zarah Sultana mentioned the party. No one really knows. But I would say also that, or I would speculate that even themselves don't really know, actually, and don't have a clear plans toward this, because a lot of people don't want a clear break from Labour, want to keep the door open for the Labour Party, others less so. And these have been all the discussions, basically, and very little of substance about, well, what's the political context, what this party needs to achieve. And I guess we'll get to it throughout the podcast, but I believe the position of this party, unless there is like an intervention by Marxists and socialists in it to put it in the right direction, I believe that the positions of this party are going to be largely like liberal in the era of like dying liberalism.
I noted, you said that it's unwilling or reluctant to break from the Labour Party. I mean, John McDonnell, Corbyn's mentor, very much in the Labour Party still. I know Momentum, they issued a statement after Sultana's announcement that she's resigning, and they were like, oh, well, we're sorry to see her go. We're going to remain within Labour for now, because this is a way to, advance a fight for socialism. So already you have the quote, left split on this question. Even the left wing of Labour can't get its act together.
Yes. Well, I think you just mentioned a very important question, because what you're touching on is that there are already significant differences within the forces that are opposed to Starmer. Mm-hmm. If you look at the forerunner of this party, or the forces that will form this organization, whatever it will become, have been in existence since the general election last year. There were a number of independent candidates. that were elected and some were almost elected, like Andrew Feinstein and so on. And there was Galway's Workers' Party. Mm-hmm. But they all have differences among themselves over a number of things. Momentum's former leader, Momentum, as I'm sure the listeners know, was really the backbone of the Corbyn movement. The former leader of Momentum, John Landsman, is now so ardently Zionist that today he's opposed to a ceasefire in Gaza. He's so much a supporter of Israel must defend itself. That's his most recent statement. Now, I'm not saying that that's the position of Momentum at the moment, but he was Corbyn's right-hand man in the time when Corbyn ran the Labour Party, and his stamp, to some extent, must be on the Momentum movement. Mm-hmm. That's just to give one example, but there are many other differences among the forces that will want to join this new formation, whatever it becomes.
So shall we dive into Corbynism? I mean, I do want to say, look, it's a lot of the left will have their own criticisms of Corbyn and Corbynism, right? You have to, if you want to be seen as a credible, even remotely credible, I think anyways, in the current context, right? And it's not just Corbyn, but for example, I was reading a statement by the Socialist Workers' Party. They're like, oh, well, we can't have another failure like Syriza or Podemos, etc. And, in the US, you see this in relation to Sanders. You always have to have criticism of Sanders. And here, it's always, you have, criticisms of Corbyn. Now, it's one thing to make a criticism of Corbyn, but it's another to make a fundamental break, like a political counterposition to Corbyn and Corbynism. So we're talking about what's wrong with Corbynism, but it's not just to sort of list off a long series of things that he could have done, because I'm sure Corbyn has criticisms of Corbynism, but really, why did this project fail? I think that's what this movement, this party must confront if it's to make any kind of impact on the working class in the coming period. Yeah,
definitely. I think that's key because, it's not just a historical question. It's on everybody's lip. As this new party, is thrown out there, the main question is, how do we avoid the last time under Corbyn? And everybody has their explanation, but I believe most of the explanation out there completely missed the mark, are based on Corbyn's personalities, or some people will maybe understand that, he kept unity with the Blairites. That wasn't good. But now in this new party, there won't be any Blairites. So we're all good. Right. And I think that would be a absolutely wrong reading of the situation. I don't know. I can just present very briefly what we think of the Corbyn period is in a very, very brief manner. Corbyn essentially effectuated a break with the working class in Britain. The working class turned its back on the left and Labour, the left Labour in general. Why? Because Corbyn spent his tenure clinging to not only just the Blairites, but to the liberals in the Labour Party, which represented the interests of the liberal wing of the ruling class. So that's in a nutshell our lesson of Corbyn. He refused to break with the liberals and liberal ideas, and that's how he lost the working class. And that's why a lot of the workers today are pushed towards Farage, the far right.
Yeah. In fact, I think it's important to say, what are the tasks in regards to building a new formation in opposition to Starmer? And one of the key things is to overcome the divisions within the working class itself, but maybe even more fundamentally is to overcome the division between the left and the working class. That is really key, because that division has been in place for quite some time, and it is the key challenge to be overcome. For example, to undercut the rise of Farage and Reform UK, for example, which is a central aim of everybody who's supporting this project.
Yeah. I mean, this is a theme in many of our episodes that we do on this show, liberalism. Unless people live under a rock, it's easy to see that the working class really hates liberalism, right? You see a turn to the right in many, many countries. But I do want to just push back, Vincent, and ask you to elaborate a little bit. You said, okay, well, Corbyn really refused to split with the Liberals. Now, we've got listeners outside of Britain. Could you maybe just make concrete? What does that mean in the British terrain? What do you mean by liberalism and Corbyn refusing to break with liberalism? I mean, is Corbyn himself is he a liberal? Could you just maybe flesh that out a little bit so that we understand, what was he pushing on the ground such that former Labour strongholds like the Red Wall in the north really just completely went Tory, right? Like, what was so hated about his policies?
Yeah, let's get into a bit of the history. So Corbyn ran in the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015. By the way, similarly to right now, Corbyn didn't want to lead the Labour Party. He was put there as the candidate of the left so that the left would have a candidate, knowing that they would lose, just like they've been doing for years and years and years under Tony Blair. And what happened is that despite him, he struck a chord among a wave of discontent in society. He just spoke the same old thing of left laborism, against austerity, against war. But then all of a sudden it intersected that wave, that post-2008 wave of discontent. And a lot of young people started to really follow him, to his surprise. And he won to his surprise, without really wanting to. So that's the thing about Corbyn. He never wants to lead. He was sort of pushed by the wave of event. And so the first concrete thing about liberalism is that as soon as he became head of the Labour Party, that is head of the official opposition of His Majesty's government, he was posed with a choice. Either you confront the ruling class and go all in, or you give in. And he found himself at the head of a party which was composed in large portion of Blairites, people who had supported the Iraq War, supported austerity, and his main concern became keeping the unity of this sort of hodgepodge coalition which had brought him to power, a base which was really looking for a candidate against austerity, against wars, and these Labourite politicians looking to advance their career and to serve the ruling class. And he sort of tried to keep all this thing together. And the first question it was posed very concretely was Brexit. Mm-hmm. So Brexit was the vote for Britain to get out of the European Union. It was a referendum. And what happened? That referendum won, obviously. And what that referendum posed was that heavily working class communities in England, in the north particularly, those communities who had been really fucked by the liberal order, by 30 years of globalization, offshoring, and really the rule of the capitalist class justifying itself under these grand liberal principles and values. Tony Blair really this was all encapsulated in the European Union. And that referendum became really a referendum on the state of the country. Do you want things to remain the same, or you don't? And what happened is that this referendum was obviously pushed by right-wing forces, and a lot of the left wanting to oppose these right-wing forces ended up supporting Remain, supporting the European Union. And Corbyn, who, by the way, had opposed the European Union basically all his life, because that's what leftists used to do, under this tremendous pressure from a part of his base and under this tremendous pressure from the party itself, because for the Blairites in the party, opposing the European Union was a red line, he campaigned for Remain and then abandoned his previous position and accepted to campaign for the European Union to maintain the unity of the party, to maintain the unity with those Blairites and those liberals. And really, this is the beginning of a drift between big section of the working class in Britain who wanted Brexit, who wanted out of the EU, and Corbyn and the liberal left and the liberal ruling class who wanted to remain very well in the EU.
I think that it's important to understand when Corbyn became Labour leader, which he was very reluctant to do, the positions that he had promised, the things that he had promised that were in the interests of the working class, he was not in a position to deliver, quite simply because you cannot, save the National Health Service, save our schools, all of the things that Corbyn promised, unless you're willing to mount a real struggle, a real confrontation with the British establishment, the British ruling class. And that is where Corbyn failed the test, because when it comes to any of the questions that were posed that made Corbyn popular, when he was a backbencher, as Vincent said, it didn't matter what his opinion was, but when he was leader of Her Majesty's opposition, it mattered. And the ruling class actually cared what he said. So he had to either push forward with the working masses, if you will, behind him, or back down and keep unity with the Blairites. And he chose the opposite. So he doesn't have the Blairites at the moment, or the Starmerites. They pushed him out. But the question remains about whether you're willing to build a party that will take on a serious confrontation with the British ruling class. And that is the only way that you can make progress for the working class and for the working people of this country. Mm-hmm. I'll just give you one example about that. When Corbyn revealed, after he was overthrown and kicked out, that when he became leader of Labour, right-wing Labour MPs sat him down and demanded an assurance that he would support any military action by Israel that Israel should undertake while he was leader of the Labour Party. Corbyn refused, but also at the time, he did not stand up against the anti-Semitism witch hunt that was directed primarily against him in the Labour Party. He didn't even make the simple point, this is all about the fact that I have stood with the Palestinians all my life. He didn't do that. Now, siding with Israel is a red line for the British bourgeoisie. That's why Labour supports the genocide. Corbyn opposes that, but he would not take a stand when it counted because it would have meant breaking with the establishment, if you like.
I mean, already in how you're laying out the Corbyn years and Corbynism in action, I mean, we're really talking about some of the fundamental problems of revolution in this country, like of forming a real working class party in the sense of, those red lines. It reminds me of parliamentary socialism, that you're just going to kind of do what's acceptable in order to get into power, like kind of the very, very crude classic sort of early 20th century British socialism. I mean, that's really what Corbynism is, adapted to the current period, or the last decade anyways. Yeah. I have a couple of questions that come out of this though, because we're using this language of, well, he refused to cross the red lines of the bourgeoisie, which is very true. And what fundamentally was a reason for his failure is that he refused to go up against the ruling class. Now, I don't think many leftists would have a disagreement by saying, oh, well, you can only solve the problems of this country by going against the ruling class. But, I don't think many socialist groups would disagree with that assessment, on the face of it. What exactly, what exactly
they all supported
sets us
Corbyn,
apart? Yeah, exactly. I guess that's where I want you to get to, because let me just give a little bit more context, because you started by saying, well, Corbyn effectuated this split where what he did really made the working class turn against the left and left wing of Labour in this country, which is very true. At the same time, Corbyn has this sort of like aura, like he's still revered. Now, that's probably a very London-centric view. I don't think that's true for the rest of the country. But Corbyn still is this kind of beacon of the left in this country. So how do we make sense of this contradiction, that he's this kind of spent force who's always just urged on, by others, who never really wants to take charge? Even some of the commentary I saw about, Zarah Sultana jumping the gun, some commentators were saying, well, she's kind of trying to urge him into action by preempting this whole announcement. But so you've got the situation where he conciliated the Liberals, and that's basically the City of London, which has destroyed this country, and that made the working class of this country turn against him. Yet for the left, and I think for, petty bourgeois London liberals and whatever, Corbyn is still seen as the be-all, end-all, right? The savior who will one day come. So how do we make sense of this contradiction in the broader context, if that makes sense?
Well, one thing I would say about that is that the left that has been waiting for Corbyn to lead them since Corbyn was kicked out as leader of the Labour Party, they share a lot of Corbyn's liberalism. Most of the left echoes the things that Corbyn stood for, for the European Union, for Remain, supported Remain at the time of the Brexit referendum, and do not have an answer to the fact that this alienated a large section of the British working class.
I think the response to this is that what we think is that most of the British left lives in cuckoo land, lives in La La Land. They think Corbyn is great. They think Corbyn is like this pope of the left. Yet, for most working people in Britain, Corbyn is this guy who went on to lead the Labour Party, ride a bicycle, was sort of a hippie liberal, was crushed by everyone, and then ended in failure. That's what Corbyn is for most people. But the left is so really afloat and totally divorced from what really has happened. That is this huge divide between the working class and the socialist movement, that they still look at Corbyn like he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, And that has been a huge factor of paralysis in the left for the last few years, because what is everyone doing? Most people in the British left, they're waiting on Corbyn, and this party thing has been a thing going on for years. Everybody, Corbyn will announce it. Corbyn will announce it. Yet Corbyn has shown so many times to be this, really incapable figure. Now, if he's part of that left party, whatever, we'll go in, we'll support it. But it's his pacifism, never wanting to pick a fight with the ruling class, which has because it's this total impotence, which I think the left is completely blind to. And actually what happened during the Corbyn period, just to briefly go on this, is that all the left totally supported and cheered on Corbyn. And of course, it was necessary to support Corbyn against the right, etc. But what Marxists had to do was to build a Marxist pole against Corbynism, against Corbyn himself. Because, everybody wanted to kick out the Blairites. You know what was the obstacle to this? Corbyn. He did it. Right. So, that's my response to why the left is, because the left lives in cuckoo land, in another planet from the rest of the country.
Right. I mean, it's a reflection of the broader division, this really hard division in this country between the South, the City of London, the Southeast more generally, and the North, the deindustrialized North, more or less. Yes.
But also the petit bourgeois liberal bubble in which the left lives and the reality.
Yes, and the complete separation from the working class. The left it's both a reflection of that and a contributing factor to that. Yeah. Just waiting for Corbyn and being in complete denial about the fact that he is hated by the majority of the working class, mostly up the north, but also in London, working class London.
Yeah. And what happened in 2019 when he lost, is because, Corbyn was trying to maintain the unity of the Labour Party, these various factions with representing completely counterposed interests and not wanting to make a fight against the interests of the ruling class. He just became impotent. And more he became just a tool and a puppet of the Blairites, the most right-wing faction. And in 2019, what happened? The election became more and more defined by Brexit and what deal for Brexit. And Boris Johnson just arrived saying, we had a referendum and my slogan is get Brexit done. And Corbyn became, sort of despite him, sort of pushed by events, the candidate for a second referendum. And he really presented himself to those working class communities who had voted Brexit as the guy who will put their vote again to test. You voted the wrong way. And he became a candidate for the establishment.
Yes.
Yeah, he became a candidate for the establishment, really.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
By not wanting to fight and defeat the establishment, the ruling class, he became sort of their tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's how a lot of the working class went with Johnson, went with Farage, turned their back not only on Corbyn, but on the left. That's so important to understand, and it hasn't been understood in the left.
Yes. And look at them. The reason that they hated Corbyn for that is because, their communities have been absolutely devastated by deindustrialization. There is a material basis for their opposition to the EU as they saw it, a number of misguided ideas in there and so on. But this is something that the left is oblivious to.
Well, I mean, if I'm a leftist, I would disagree with you. I don't think the left ignores it. I think it's actually worse. Well, maybe. But I think what they do is they have really moralistic, sort of wishy-washy solutions. Well, their answer to the sort of right-wing reaction in the immigration question is, let all the refugees in, which we can get to. But I don't think it's that they ignore these questions, but I think they have left liberal solutions that are really based on moralistic platitudes, but not actually addressing the underlying causes of the division and the disunities among the working class and where it stems from.
Yeah. But I do think Eibhlin has a point in the sense of, I think a lot of the left is oblivious to how destructive the liberal order of the last 20, 30 years was to large sections of the working class. Mm-hmm. A lot of the left, supports the EU, supports these liberal values and principle. Immigration, this is just great, and if you question it, you're a racist. And I think all of these things and more show that there's not this understanding of what it meant the last 30 years for poor and impoverished communities.
Mm-hmm.
I do think this is a real point in the British left, and which is largely concentrated in big cities, middle class elements, actually, who had it not so bad for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So I do think there is a point here of where that the source of that disconnect.
Yeah. I do agree with you, Mansa, that their opposition to racism is purely, at the level of ideas, scolding working class people for being racist and so on. What I was referring to is, where's their program to really address the fact that all of the good jobs have been destroyed in those communities up and down the country, and or even the recognition that this is a factor in what has driven the working class into opposition, not only to the European Union, but to Corbyn and to the whole liberal London-based elite. It's that, nobody cares about them. And in fact, when they look at Farage and Reform UK, it's in part because they think he's on their side. Someone is listening to us. which is, and they think Farage is the only
Or
party
Tommy
doing
Robinson
that.
even.
Or Tommy Robinson, yes.
Right. I mean, in a sense, what we've seen in Britain follows a trend that we've seen in other Western countries. I'm thinking in relation to Trump as well. Just this need for an anti-establishment figure. Unfortunately, time and again, that figure always comes from the right wing because the left refuses to make a break with these pillars of the post-Soviet period. I mean, this is what defines our organization. It's political and theoretical understanding of what's gone wrong since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why is the left in this state of weakness and disarray? It was really to do with not fundamentally rooting all opposition in liberalism, which we love saying that word, but what that is just that it's the dominant ideas of the American ruling class and all of its junior imperialist powers, for example, in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Canada, etc. It's just those ideas, right? Like you have the ruling class, you have big giant corporations waving pride flags. That's liberalism. That is what it is.
Yes.
All this wokeness sponsored by multinational corporations, Starmer showing up at Pride events, all of these things. They did all
Green
this.
Party, support to Ukraine.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's these ideas which are fundamentally rooted in the material interests of the City of London, of the ruling classes, but that they kind of use as these woke, nice things. But behind them are just attacks, one after another against the working class, whether that's deindustrialization, whether that's rolling through, eco-ULEZ policies, just all kinds of other crazy shit. Anyways, so that's to kind of render that concrete. But I think I've forgotten exactly where I was going with this.
But I think that rant leads us a little bit to what is going to be the problem of that new party today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yes, I definitely do agree. However, we are in Britain. We are discussing the Labour Party. We haven't yet talked about the trade union bureaucracy and Corbynism vis-a-vis, or the trade union bureaucracy vis-a-vis Corbynism, because of course I think that had a huge role to play as well.
Yes.
Yeah, good point.
Yes. So this will be a problem for the new party. The conception of most of the left has always been, a new party of the working class must be based on the trade union bureaucracy, because that's how it was with Labour. Often in the past, you would have had a left-right division within the trade union bureaucracy. And so if there was a split from the right wing of Labour, you might expect that the left wing of the trade union bureaucracy might be interested in it. Who's the left wing of the trade union bureaucracy today? I think it's kind of non-existent. Kabady in the NEU.
Eddie Dempsey in the RMT.
Eddie Dempsey in the RMT.
Eddie Dempsey in the RMT.
Some would say Sharon Graham in Unite, but...
Yes. But okay, where have they been on Palestine? Where have they been on any question of class struggle? And, I think it's quite telling that much of the left have been either supported in the past, the existing trade union bureaucrats, or continuing to support them in the present, such as Sharon Graham, and just will not break from them and don't see them as an obstacle to taking forward the struggles of the working class.
Yeah, I think most workers correctly view the big trade union leaders as sort of part of the establishment. Mm-hmm. Now it's not a whole developed view or whatever, and we have a whole scientific characterization of, the aristocracy of labor, but that initial impulse is correct. The trade union leaders, certainly the right wing, but also often the left wing by their silence on the right wing, is all part of this establishment, which actually right now props up Starmer, and which has, over the past 30 years, really just negotiated the givebacks and the defeats of the working class, one after the other. And honestly, when we do speak to workers, when we sell the papers, and honestly, what we find when we meet workers in trade unions, they hate the leadership, or often we meet militant workers who are not in the unions because they quit it in anger at all the sellouts. Yeah, that's another way.
That's what I was getting at, because again, I think it's really key to understand that Corbyn's betrayals made the working class turn against the left. Right? But within that, right, I think the trade union bureaucracy itself has played such a contemptuous role that a lot of workers rightly look with distrust at the unions, because they hate the union leaderships. And I was just trying to get what the sort of connection is between left labor and the trade union bureaucracy and the shift amongst the working class to the right.
I think it's not only with Corbyn. They've done their own thing. We can talk about the strike wave and how it was a defeat, honestly. We can talk about various conflicts that happened where they played a wretched role. But I think at bottom, the similarity between the trade union bureaucracy and Corbyn and stuff, and that the coming problem with that new party is that none of these forces wanted or want a real fight with the ruling class, with the establishment, like a real throw the gauntlet on the ground and let's get into a struggle. That's at bottom, that's the problem with Corbyn, with these trade union bureaucrats who propped up the Labour Party and support Starmer, even with the most left-wing one who speak left but then don't do anything different. No one wants a real struggle. Yeah, and so the task of socialists is not to support those people or support the most left-sounding person, but it's to build oppositions to these people based on the class struggle principle. That is, we will put up a fight against the ruling class, and we'll put up a fight against those who don't want to put up a fight against the ruling class.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I of course agree with you, but I also know that if this was so common sense and, it was like, aha, that's what I needed to hear, then more and more people would be listening to us. It's just not the case, right? Like I'm referring to our arguments that we have with leftists all the time, right? There's 100 different ways in which they justify not building that fundamental opposition to the bureaucracy within the unions, right? It's like, oh, well, you gotta take where workers are at. Otherwise, you're just adventurist, or you gotta push the more left wing leader in opposition to the right wing leader, right? There's just like you and I, the three of us are here talking about this, like this is so obvious, but I do want to just like it's not that obvious to the left, and that's not to excuse them, but I'm just thinking in terms of like, how do we deal with some of these obstacles, I guess is my question, because they do exist.
I'd hope to get a little bit more concrete. I want to mention the Birmingham bin strike, for example, which is being left to just rot on the vine. Those strikers.
Do I just give a context for the bin strike, actually? Because
bin strike, the strikers, the bin workers in Birmingham have been on all-out strike since the 7th of March. Their union is mainly Unite. The city commissioners and the city council have even refused to negotiate. They imposed £8,000 per year pay cut on now 2 groups of workers on the bin service. And the union's game plan to fight this has proven absolutely useless. They are being left just on their own, in complete isolation, up against the city council and the commissioners. And the only way to explain it, you would not know this from reading the socialist newspapers in this country, that this is an absolute scandal, what is happening to these workers. So to understand why it's like that, you have to know that the commissioners that I mentioned are working on behalf of the Labour government in Westminster. The City Council is a Labour council, and the union is the largest donor to the Labour Party. So workers on the picket line who get furious about what's happening to them will just sometimes shout at us, cut the funding, pull the plug on the funding to Labour. Mm-hmm. The left is not even saying that. And, the obstacle to victory is that you need to bring out the whole working class of the city of Birmingham and not leave the bin strikers on their own, because that's the only way that you can bring the city to a halt and negotiate from a position of strength. The point about the socialist movement and the left in regard to the strike is they're not even saying that there's a problem with how it's being led. They do not see themselves as a factor. Occasionally they will do, picket, but nobody among them believes that this will make any difference to the outcome. It makes workers feel that they're being supported, but that's all. They are not trying to make a difference to the outcome. They're not trying to win the strike, for example. I think that's a really good example of the role that the left plays in regards to the trade union bureaucracy, and how the trade union bureaucrats ties to Labour. It means that you're fighting with your hands tied behind your back unless you're willing to put forward an alternative leadership in the unions. We put a leaflet saying, workers, take matters into your own hands. This existing leadership's game plan is going to lose.
If we could just go back to the question of a new party, you can see that if this new party tries and seeks to integrate leaders of the trade unions who lead these sorts of strike, how this will just continue to alienate the bulk of the working class. It's one point out of many, out of a general strategy, but a new left party that wants to be socialist has to oppose the current trade union leaders and actually reach the working class and present a different strategy, a socialist one, to win these strikes.
Okay, so we've been talking for Corbyn for a minute, and we've been discussing the lessons. I think it would be useful if we can be succinct. Like, here are the Sparts, here are the lessons that they put forward of the Corbyn period, and these are the lessons that this new party should definitely assimilate in terms of going forward. So if either of you can actually just sum up, what are the lessons of Corbynism that we've got to put out there?
Well, I would come back on my initial comment of what broke Corbyn was maintaining an alliance with liberals, with the liberal wing of the ruling class, who supports the EU, supports Ukraine, who supports NATO as well. We haven't mentioned NATO. Okay. Supports the status quo basically in Britain, is to cling to it.
So lesson number one,
lesson number one,
to the liberals.
Ditch the liberals. That's my lesson number one.
Lesson number one, yes. Ditch the liberals. Okay, cool. What's lesson number two?
Turn to the working class. And, you must try to unite the working class in opposition to the British establishment and offer policies that are in their interests,
I mean, ultimately, I think it's summed up by making a fundamental break with the status quo. And we'll get to, as I mentioned at the outset, different left groups have published their own statements about what this party should do, what its program should be like. But the key line has to be in fundamental opposition to the material interests of the ruling class, not just saying nice things. Because I think the trap in British politics is always push the left-wing alternative forward in opposition to the right-wing alternative, and not seeing it as a working class versus a ruling class thing. Anyways, bringing this down to what Eibhlin just left off at, the divisions that exist within this country. I mean, last summer there was riots in this country. Tommy Robinson and this huge provocation. It was a pretty fearful time, I think, for a lot of minorities and Muslims in this country. The right wing is growing, and unfortunately, how Farage is doing in the polls, a lot of it comes from the ranks of the working class. And there's real distrust, there's real disunity amongst the oppressed religious minorities and others. So if we are going to have a new party that claims it's going to be a working class, pro-socialist party, one of its tasks obviously has to be to deal with the state of affairs amongst the working population. So what do we have to say about this? What do we have to offer on that problem itself?
It's obviously a huge problem, and probably the European Union is not going to be such a big question for that coming party, but immigration will surely be one. And it's a question what position it will take. Now, I don't have all the slogans or all the ready-made thing, but I can tell you what not to do, and which will also tell us what to do. So far, the polarization we've been seeing on immigration is that you've had the ruling class for many, many years, which as part of their policy, the British ruling class has brought an increasing number of immigrants to really depress the working class as a whole. They use them as cheap labor. And what has happened is obviously right-wing forces have seized on this to divert sort of the discontent toward immigrants rather than the ruling class. But what the left has largely been doing is just sort of, I'm going to use the L word again, liberal stuff. And I'll be very concrete about it. They've been really moralizing workers, launching campaigns about the need to love immigrants and the need for diversity. For example, the SWP's reaction to that new left party is basically to put forward what is essentially a completely liberal program on immigration, like, refugees are welcome here and whatever. Now, of course, the new party must oppose anti-immigrant bigotry, must oppose the deportation of immigrants, must fight for full citizenship rights for immigrants. However, there's a way to do this that's a liberal way and a working class way. And so the slogan, for example, refugees are welcome here, which you hear in all left demos, is really a liberal slogan because it's a slogan which is directed not at the ruling class, but at those working class communities where refugees are sent, working class communities which are devastated, deindustrialized, have nothing, and the government purposefully sent the refugees in these communities, creates tension. And that slogan essentially is viewed by the working class as an attack on them, not on the government. So whatever left party there is has to have a break with liberal views and policy on immigration in the left, which have been so widespread and which have tended to just justified the status quo and honestly justified what has been the dominant policy of the British imperialist rulers for many years. So it includes, for example, linking the plight of working class community, white or British born working class community, with that of the refugees, and trying to connect that anger together and channel it against the ruling class. But that requires explicitly a fight against those liberal stuff that the SWP and others are going to try to push in the movement and reinforce this divide between the left and the working class.
Yes, I think the basic point is that a chunk of the working class that is now looking to reform must be broken from this reactionary movement, and it cannot be done by liberal ideology, but by showing that the class struggle that is necessary to turn things around for the working class in this country requires that they must take up the cause of migrant workers. The whole working class, in order to advance, must take up the cause of migrant workers. And to do that, again, I think puts you into opposition to the existing trade union leadership. But you must win over that section of the working class that now looks to Farage and offer them a way forward that advances their own cause against the ruling class.
Unless you guys have more to say on this point, I want to start getting to some of the other outfits that exist currently on the British terrain that have sought to mark themselves out as sort of working class alternatives to Labour. I'm thinking here of Galloway's Workers' Party. Do you guys have more to say on how to bridge that gap?
Yep. The other thing about bridging the divide in the working class in the struggle for a new left party is going also to be about bridging the differences among the oppressed. So, for example, in this new left party, you'll have gays, you'll have trans, you'll have, LGBTQ plus people, and then you'll have Muslims. You'll have immigrant communities who are quite conservative socially.
Socially, yeah.
How are you going to, you cannot bridge these differences on the basis of like liberalism, love the other and celebrate our diversity type thing. The only basis to bridge this is complete opposition to the British imperialists and the understanding that it's not that we need to love each other or whatever, but we have a common material economic interest in fighting the rulers. It's going to be better for all of us, all those groups. But if you have hippy-dippy liberals who lead this party, these divisions will obviously come to the fore. So that would be my other point about bridging divisions among the oppressed.
I think that's useful because one of my worries is, as you're making these points, somebody listening could be like, "Oh, these guys really suck. They don't want to say love the refugees or love the oppressed and whatever." But I think it's to make the point that let's just imagine this concretely. Social conservatism is a reality. And you can't force these ideas that people are not ready for upon them. And likewise, and the flip side, right? Like you can't alienate the trans people because the Muslims don't want it, but you can't alienate the Muslims because the trans people don't want it. But guess what? Both of them need, a real vehicle in which both of their actual interests of fighting for better things can be advanced. So how do you build this unity? And I think the basic point that we're trying to make is it's not through nice words. It's not through being sensitive about each other's feelings and having the flag or whatever. But I think it's just to show, like, look, both these groups and many other groups, what they all share is that they are fucked by British imperialism. So if they can just unite on that basis, that will do wonders for the entire movement of the oppressed and the working class. And I think that's it sounds like a very elementary point. But again, when these things play out within the movement, it immediately fragments into like 1,000 different directions because it's always about this competition of the different identities on a completely moralist sort of basis.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right there. It just reinforces existing divisions within the population and within the working class. And in that sense, it's a negative.
Or conceding to some of that backwardness. For example, the Workers' Party, they understand correctly that you can't unite the working class by just saying refugees are welcome here. And they understand the reaction. However, what they do is that they sort of take reform slogans on it. They have a thing called tough on immigration, tough on the causes of immigration. It's really, but working class people who have anti-immigrant prejudice or whatever, they're not going to vote for the Workers' Party because of this. They're going to vote for the real thing. They're going to vote for reform.
Yeah, exactly.
And that just actually reinforced these same division, particularly in the Workers' Party where there's a ton of immigrants. It's kind of a recipe for disaster.
Well, the Workers' Party is not oblivious to the fact that there are these divisions within the population. So Vincent mentioned between Muslims, for example, and LGBTQ+. Yes, there are divisions, speaking in general terms. But how the Workers' Party deals with that is to pander to conservative sentiments among the Muslim population and, absolutely refuse to defend trans rights, for example. And they're against abortion. And so they themselves adopt socially conservative positions. And that's their way of kind of dealing with these divisions within, rather than being able to overcome them. They look to the Muslim constituency and refuse to take up trans rights, LGBTQ rights, or anything.
Yeah, Galloway's quite hard on the whole LGBTQ plus agenda, which is quite reactionary. But I was going to say that, so after Zarah Sultana put this announcement out, Galloway had his own tweet saying, Corbyn's had my number for 40 years. We're ready to build electoral alliances and so on. But here I am thinking, well, one, jumping the gun a little bit, but two, say this new project gets off the ground. I mean, I do think it poses a little bit of the question of, well, what's the point of the Workers' Party? You've got the real thing. You got Farage for the right wing, socially conservative views. And then you'll have Corbyn and co doing the other stuff. So what's going to be the need for Galloway?
Yes, I think that's what Galloway is responding to. In fact, Galloway's party has been stagnant since the general election a year ago because their conception of building a party is simply to run election campaigns, not to involve themselves as a party in, for example, opposition to genocide in Gaza, supporting the working class and struggle or wherever. So they're already in a kind of stagnant position. And now Galloway sees a possible competitor on the electoral front and would like to be part of it in some kind of an alliance, non-aggression pact or, electoral agreement.
Yeah, yep. I think the problem of the Workers' Party is quite simple. They pander to these backward position that we've discussed, which ends up capitulating to the ruling class and doesn't undercut the right, actually. And then they're not a party of the class struggle. They don't look at the class struggle as like the motive force of change in the society. They look at council election and parliament and blah, blah, blah. And that's what they've been doing for the past year. Yeah. And it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But however, I do think that this is also going to be a problem for the new party, because one of the basic idea that animated some of Galloway's supporter was not wrong. The people around Galloway often want to be really anti-imperialist, anti-NATO, anti-British imperialism, pro-Palestine, and they don't like the liberal left. Now, that might take all sorts of direction and misguided conclusions, but there is a correct impulse about the liberal left. And that's why one of the reasons we campaigned with the Workers' Party in the last election. So it's going to be a challenge you have to bring some of these people together. But again, how are you going to unite them? You have to take what's good with them, that is, ditch the liberals, take the anti-imperialism, the against NATO, the for Palestine. However, you have to wage a struggle against the adaptation to this backwardness, which will inevitably, alienate trans, gays, and those who want to defend them. But again, the basis for this, and we sort of repeating the same point, we come back, it's only in opposition to the British imperialist rulers and their liberal defenders.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe I'll just add a tiny point on the Workers' Party, since you mentioned the election. The left criticized the Workers' Party quite correctly for the positions on, LGBTQ plus rights and so on. But we supported them because they were willing to stand against left Labour candidates, including John McDonnell in the last election, which the left themselves was unwilling to do in Tulsa. Yeah. So I just wanted to add that one.
And I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I've been thinking since Zarah Sultana finally got the backbone to do this is, well, where was this when the election was happening? Like, where our position, our framework for the election was, you need to build a working class alternative to Labour. And we, I think, controversially stood out on the left for saying no support to any Labour candidate, even the most left-wing ones like John McDonnell, like Zarah Sultana. Zarah Sultana has headlined so many of these Palestine marches and spoken at so many of those stages, and she's constantly tweeting against the genocide and so on and so forth. It's like, well, where was your bloody wisdom when this was happening? Why did you help to get this party into power? First, you know that Starmer is hell-bent on purging the left, so congratulations, you've just got that done to yourself. Second, just what's this sort of strategic moment now? I mean, if this moment had happened actually prior to the general election, we would be in a much better off position, I think. I think it could have actually really helped maybe the state of the left and the working class. Maybe I'm wrong in that assessment, but I think the fundamental point I want to make. And we wrote about this and we said, look, if Sultana is willing to stand in opposition to Starmer, we will campaign for her. But the class line for us is no vote to this anti-working class, pro-genocide party. And these left Labour candidates like MacDonald, like Sultana, they muddied the waters. And any left group, any socialists who supported them did the same. And that's complete betrayal, because what they did is indeed they helped get Starmer elected, get Starmer's party elected. And now they're out here moaning and talking about socialism and barbarism. It gets me really worked up that this bullshit, happens time and time again. And I think this is also one reason why the workers don't take the left seriously, because they do these shenanigans. It's this bullshit according to their own, whatever their secret plans are about their secretive discussions in the Workers' Party. It's like, come on, do the things when it counts.
I entirely agree with you about that and about Zarah Sultana last year. I think it's a really important point. There was the task that we set ourselves to do was to try and build an opposition, pro-working class opposition to Starmer as possible. It would have made a huge difference if Zarah Sultana and John McDonnell and those people had broken with Starmer back then. Everything that Starmer has done is not a surprise at all. So, here they are 1 year later. One could say, yes, it's an important development, but what took you so long?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a genuine question. I think if I go to their first open town hall thing, that is one question I would ask. But anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. So let's start. We've been talking for almost an hour. Let's start wrapping up by getting a little bit of the terrain of the left. As I mentioned at the outset, many groups have issued their sort of statements. I actually checked today. God, this is going to be a really narrow bubble point, but leftist train spotter, somebody had asked, where is the Spartacist Britain statement on this question? But
okay.
So the left has been saying stuff. Do we want to just make a quick commentary on what that is?
I have a point on this.
Yeah, go on.
Just a general point. I think this whole discussion, we've been talking about this, the left doesn't talk about what we've been talking about. What you're reading these statement is long stuff about how the party needs a proper structure, the party needs to be democratic, the party needs to have trade unions in it, the party needs to be linked to the social movement. And no one is discussing really the context in which this party takes place. It's going to be tough because it's a much more right-wing context than 2016. There's a much more bigger divide between the working class and the left, as we've banged on about for an hour. And no one is starting from that, sort of starting point and asking, well, how do we rebuild this? I.e., what program do we need? What sort of party do we want to build? As insofar as they will talk about program is like the last thing on their letter saying, oh yeah, by the way, we need the sort of socialist program. And it's sort of irrelevant. Meanwhile, the whole lesson of the last decade, it's like you need a party with people who are ready to go to war with the ruling class. That's the problem.
Well, again, I already know several hundred people who will scream if they heard you say this. I don't think they will because they don't listen. But I'm thinking of Fiona Lawley of the Revolutionary Communist Party, who wrote an open letter, who it turns out has been involved in these discussions about a workers' party. Yeah. And, look, let's be serious. These guys are more than happy to go up against the ruling class. They are for communism, right? Fiona Lawley, she explicitly says, look, we need to debate the program. We need to talk about program. So, what you've said, listen, again, in spirit, I agree with you, but I think we have to sort of make our polemics a little bit more convincing, because these are the guys who say they're good for it. Yeah. But however, in my reading anyways, I do think there's problems with what Fiona Lawley's putting out there in terms of what this new party should do. Do you want to maybe just elaborate on what those problems are?
Well, yeah, she wrote an open letter to the people who are supposed to form the Workers' Party, the new left party. And yeah, it's basically just like an argument as to why the party has to be anti-capitalist and socialist. But it's sort of that is obviously good. That's kind of classic RCP, this sort of vague proposition to those leaders, that as if Zarah Sultana concluded her statement by saying it's socialism or barbarism. So what is Fiona Lawley adding with a plea that the party refuses capitalism and be for socialism? Right. Nothing. There is one point that I will note that I do agree with her thing that I do think is good, and she insisted that the party also needs to be anti-Zionist. Now, I do think this gets a little more concrete in terms of drawing the sort of line we need to draw. So I do agree with this point, but it needs to be much more. You see, the way the RCP approached that effort, And we approach that for the whole thing we've been discussing is like how this party will be a failure if it doesn't address the central lesson of the last decade. And the central lesson is really ditch the liberals and link up with the working class. But the letter of Fiona Lally doesn't address any of this, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
But for the partial exception of the anti-Zionist point. Now, this is not an insult to all RCP members. I'm not saying that all RCP members don't want to fight capitalism or whatever. Of course, they all want to fight capitalism. That's why they're in the RCP. But I do believe that this approach is absolutely not like revolutionary at all in terms of drawing the kinds of revolutionary line that's needed. And by the way, she's been in these discussions for like the whole year. Like, hello, what did you discuss, you guys? Like, what has happened,
I also think in reading the open letter, there's very little in there about the lessons of Corbynism, which we've been talking about for the last hour. What are their lessons of Corbynism? And we've talked about red lines for the British bourgeoisie, no to NATO and so on. So she does mention Zionism as the only thing that approximates to a red line for the British ruling class. She does not elaborate on what that means. I mean, it's true. Yes, you need to oppose Zionism, but how? And talking about being against capitalism and being for socialism does not draw a line. That's not a red line for the British bourgeoisie. Corbyn, everybody is, as long as you're vaguely for socialism. The question is, what are you going to do? How are you going to achieve the things that you're promising? Mm-hmm. And that she stays away from. So it's very uncontroversial and, not particularly distinctive, I think, what Fiona Lally put forward.
Right. I know. I think that is the key point. I mean, I kind of chuckled because when I read the open letter and then I reread Zarah Sultana's tweet, it was kind of like Zarah Sultana's Fiona Lally light, the whole socialism versus barbarism. It's like, what is the actual difference, right? Like, say this party exists, the RCP makes an entry. What are they going to be fighting for? They're basically saying two versions of the same thing. So what exactly are you fighting for to impact? How are you impacting the political program of this party? Where Sultana's saying, I'm Rosa Luxemburg, socialism or barbarism. Fiona Lally's saying the same thing. All right. Mm-hmm. So, for me, it was kind of striking that for all the sort of bravado of the RCP and being revolution against the billionaires, those are all, great abstract things. But what does this really mean on the ground? And what it showed me is that it kind of starts to minimize the differences that actually exist between left Labour, ex-Labour now MP, and the RCP. You've already talked about the Socialist Workers' Party. It's almost like we're back in 2000s, like just wrote 2000 slogans about refugees welcome here, like blah, blah, just like very lame. But that's standard SWP for you. But you've talked about the Socialist Party at some point because their main thing for some years has been to build a new Workers' Party based on the trade unions. And again, somewhat like the Galloway question, if this organization gets off the ground, it really does pose for the SP what their new definitive contribution will be as well, because, what if you have trade unions affiliating to this thing? So anyways, those are kind of sort of known quantities on the left. Are there other sort of flavors on the British left in terms of what else people have said? Yeah.
There are many people who are advocating that whatever this new party that comes has to ally with the Green Party.
Yeah.
We have to talk
Green
about
Party,
this.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
You want to go, Eibhlin? I think you feel strongly about this.
I feel strongly about this. The left, from Owen Jones all the way across to the far left, are completely infatuated with the Greens. In particular, in Britain, it's been a particular thing since last year when they won 4 members of Parliament.
Yeah, and their new leader or candidate.
The new leader or the incumbent leader, Zach Polanski. Everyone is hoping that Zach Polanski will become the leader of the Greens because he's much more kind of social democratic and left wing in his outlook. And I might say, as a parenthetical point, they won 4 seats in the general election last year by running on a version of Corbynism with some environmentalist coloration. Mm-hmm. But the Greens are a pro-establishment party, however they may posture when they have nothing. And they are hated by the working class because workers in the steel plants in Port Talbot and Scunthorpe lost their jobs Thousands of workers lost their jobs in the name of environmentalism. The Luton car factory closed in the name of environmentalism. And in London itself, we have the ULEZ charge on older cars coming into the city. And the left doesn't take into account, when they're looking doe-eyed at the Green Party, what this party actually represents and what it means to the working class. And just to add one other point, it's easy for the Greens to posture kind of radical, kind of Corbyn light when they're in opposition or they don't amount to much. But in countries where they actually formed part of the government, like in Germany, which is where they lead, they were pro-NATO, on the Ukraine war, out-and-out warmongers. In Ireland, they formed part of the government. They are absolutely hated, were trounced in the last election because they were for vicious working class austerity. So it's easy to say nice things and offer nice things to people when it doesn't count. But the infatuation of the left with the Greens is an absolute turn-off to the working class.
Yeah. So, summary, we don't agree with Owen Jones.
No, we don't. I think Evelyn is absolutely right that I think a new party needs an alliance with the Green, like a new hole in the head, like, and I think that's good. I know that's going to be controversial. And again, I'm not against like working with Greens for a particular thing. Like that's not, but the issue we've been discussing is how the left is completely split from the working class, and joining up with the Green is the best way to deepen that problem, really. And as socialists have to fight this. We have to get serious. We can't let one thing, actually, I think how the Green Party could be useful is if this new party really had a good program. I would use the Green as a form of division, actually. Here you have the party of the liberal hippie ecologists.
Yes.
So you join them. We are the party of workers and socialists. That's how I would use the Green Party as a useful division. You want to be a liberal and a hippie, you join the Green Party. You want to be for the working class and for socialism, you join us. That would be actually a useful division on the left. However, those who are just want to unite this whole thing, want to, it's completely going to, sabotage that new left initiative, I think.
Yes. And if I can just add a small point on the need for electoral coalitions or arrangements with the Green Party. This is something I felt strongly about for a whole year. If the Greens had stood down and not opposed Leanne Mohammed in Ilford, we wouldn't have Wes Streeting as a member of Parliament.
What else? Is there anything that we've missed in this lengthy chat about what this new party needs doing?
I'm sure there are plenty of things, but I think just to wrap up on our we haven't raised like demands or a full program, but I think we've motivated enough how this party needs a program. And a lot of people talk about the importance of program, and that's right. But the purpose of the program must be really what we've hammered, to really ditch the liberals and reconnect with the working class. Yeah, if that's not the goal of that program and it seeks to do something else, then it's wrong, and it's going to end up in a disaster. And if socialists, those who claim to be for revolution, let this party to be run by like liberals who are going to try to, conciliate with the positions of the ruling class, it will be run to the ground. These are some of the lessons of Corbyn that need to be applied.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we've obviously published a few key articles on the past period in British politics to do with Corbynism, to do with the last general election. I'll link those in the show notes so listeners have a clearer understanding of where we're coming from. And I think on that note, and I'm sure this is not the last time we'll be talking about this, depending on what happens, if whole thing crashes and burns, I'm sure we can do another bonus episode analyzing the crash and burn. But, if this gets off the ground, like I said at the start, this would be a good development, but socialists have to fight like hell to actually turn it into a vehicle that the working class looks to and would be proud to associate itself with, not some hippy-dippy liberal London-centric mess. All right. Okay, so on that note, I think that's it for us today. Okay. Thank you, comrades, for coming on board and sharing your lessons and such. All right, so we'll see you next time.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.